The story of Britain is a story of war, and it begins with waves of invasion that shaped its very soul. Long before it was a united kingdom, the island was a prize sought by many. The Romans were the first to truly conquer and colonize, arriving in 43 AD. They brought roads, cities, and a military system that held the land for nearly 4 centuries. Their legions fought fierce Celtic tribes, pushing the frontier north and building Hadrian's Wall to mark the edge of their known world. This long period of Roman rule left a deep imprint, creating a foundation of order and infrastructure that would be fought over for generations to come. After the Romans departed in the early 5th century, Britain fell into a period of chaos, becoming vulnerable to new arrivals. From across the North Sea came the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. These Germanic tribes were warriors and farmers, and they pushed the native Romano-British peoples to the western fringes of the island, into what we now call Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. They established their own kingdoms like Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria, and their languages and cultures laid the groundwork for what would eventually become England. This was a brutal, fragmented era, defined by constant, small-scale warfare between rival kings vying for land and power. Just as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to coalesce, a new terror appeared on the horizon. The Vikings. These Norse raiders and warriors arrived in their iconic longships, first to plunder monasteries and then to conquer and settle. Their great heathen army swept across the land in the 9th century, toppling kingdoms until only Alfred the Great of Wessex stood against them. Alfred's hard-won victories were crucial, not just for saving his kingdom, but for preserving the idea of an English identity. The struggle against the Vikings forged a sense of common purpose among the Anglo-Saxons, paving the way for a unified England. The final, and perhaps most transformative invasion came in 1066. William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel with his army, claiming the English throne. At the Battle of Hastings, he defeated King Harold Godwinson, ending centuries of Anglo-Saxon rule in a single bloody day. The Norman conquest was more than just a change of king. It was a complete reshaping of English society. William and his followers imposed a new French-speaking aristocracy, a feudal system of land ownership, and a military culture centered on stone castles and armored knights. This event fundamentally altered England's destiny, tying it closer to continental Europe and setting the stage for centuries of future conflicts. The Norman conquest installed a new warrior elite in England, and their focus quickly turned to consolidating power at home and expanding it abroad. The centuries that followed were defined by near-constant warfare. English kings fought to control Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, slowly bringing the British Isles under a single, often brutal authority. Castles, once a symbol of Norman oppression, became the cornerstones of royal power, their stone walls witnessing countless sieges and skirmishes. This was the age of the knight in shining armor, but the reality was far grittier than the legends. Warfare was a tool for political control, used to crush rebellions and enforce the will of the monarch upon a restive population. The most famous conflict of the Middle Ages was undoubtedly the 100 Years' War against France, which raged intermittently from 1337 to 1453. This epic struggle was born from the English king's claims to the French throne, a legacy of their Norman ancestry. The war saw some of England's most legendary victories, such as Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. At these battles, the English longbow, a simple yet devastatingly effective weapon, proved superior to the heavily armored French knights. These victories created a powerful sense of national pride and identity, with figures like Edward III and Henry V becoming national heroes. It was a war that defined English military strategy for a century. However, the long and costly war in France ultimately ended in failure for the English. By 1453, they had lost all their continental possessions, except for the port of Calais. The return of disgruntled soldiers and bankrupt nobles to England created a volatile political climate. This instability erupted into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal series of civil wars fought between two rival branches of the royal family: the House of Lancaster, represented by a red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by a white rose. For 30 years, the English aristocracy tore itself apart in a bloody power struggle for the crown. The Wars of the Roses finally concluded in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. There, Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, defeated and killed the Yorkist king, Richard III. Henry VII's victory ushered in the Tudor dynasty and marked the end of the medieval period in England. He was a shrewd and calculating ruler who understood that the country was weary of war. He focused on restoring stability, curbing the power of the nobles, and rebuilding the royal treasury. His reign laid the foundations for a more centralized and powerful state, one that would soon look beyond Europe and towards a new age of global exploration and empire. With the internal conflicts of the Middle Ages largely settled, England, and later Britain, began to look outwards. The 16th and 17th centuries saw the nation transform into a formidable naval power. This was the era of exploration, trade, and piracy, all of which were intertwined with military might. Queen Elizabeth I famously encouraged privateers like Sir Francis Drake to raid the treasure-laden ships of the Spanish Empire. These actions were part state-sponsored piracy and part undeclared war, and they brought vast wealth back to England while chipping away at the dominance of its Catholic rival Spain. It was this growing confidence at sea that set the stage for Britain's imperial ambitions. The ultimate test of this rising naval power came in 1588 with the Spanish Armada. King Philip II of Spain, infuriated by English piracy and Protestantism, sent a massive fleet to invade England and depose Queen Elizabeth I. The English fleet, though smaller, was faster and more maneuverable. Led by commanders like Drake and Lord Howard of Effingham, they used clever tactics and favorable weather, the famous Protestant wind, to scatter and defeat the mighty Armada. This victory was a turning point. It secured England's independence, boosted national morale, and announced to the world that a new major player had emerged in the contest for control of the seas. Over the next 2 centuries, the Royal Navy became the engine of British expansion. It protected burgeoning trade routes, established colonies in North America and the Caribbean, and fought a series of wars against its European rivals, primarily the Dutch and the French. The Navy enabled Britain to project power across the globe, creating and defending a network of trading posts and settlements that would evolve into the British Empire. Control of the seas meant control of global commerce, and Britain relentlessly pursued this advantage. The famous song, Rule, Britannia, written in 1740, wasn't just a piece of music, it was a declaration of national strategy. This era of naval warfare reached its zenith during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte's ambition was to dominate Europe, and Britain was his most persistent enemy. While Napoleon's armies were supreme on land, the Royal Navy, under the command of brilliant admirals like Horatio Nelson, was invincible at sea. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Nelson achieved a stunning victory over a combined French and Spanish fleet, though he lost his own life in the process. Trafalgar shattered Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain and ensured British naval supremacy for the next century. It was the Navy that allowed Britain to resist Napoleon, and ultimately, to defeat him. The 19th century, often called the Pax Britannica, was the high watermark of the British Empire. Following the final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, Britain stood as the world's sole superpower. Its Royal Navy policed the oceans, its merchants dominated global trade, and its factories powered the Industrial Revolution. Under the long reign of Queen Victoria, the empire expanded dramatically, covering nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and ruling over a quarter of its population. This expansion was not peaceful. It was driven by a series of colonial wars fought to secure resources, open markets, and impose British authority on peoples across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Despite its global dominance, the empire faced constant challenges, both from rival powers and from within its own territories. The Crimean War, from 1853 to 1856, saw Britain, alongside France and the Ottoman Empire, fighting Russia to halt its expansion towards the Mediterranean. This conflict was notorious for its military mismanagement and the horrific conditions faced by the soldiers, famously highlighted by Florence Nightingale's nursing efforts. It was a wake-up call, exposing serious weaknesses in the British Army's organization and logistics, and prompting much-needed reforms. The war showed that even a superpower could be humbled by poor planning and a determined enemy. Throughout the Victorian era, the British Army was engaged in countless so-called small wars to expand and police the empire. From the Opium Wars in China, to the Anglo-Zulu War in southern Africa and conflicts on the northwest frontier of India, British soldiers fought in diverse and challenging environments. These campaigns were often brutal and reflected the vast technological gap between the industrialized British forces and their opponents. However, they also produced shocking defeats, such as the massacre at Asandalwana, which served as stark reminders of the costs and perils of empire building. These wars were a constant feature of imperial life, shaping the military and the public's perception of Britain's role in the world. The century of empire closed with another difficult conflict, the Second Boer War, from 1899 to 1902 in South Africa. The British expected a quick victory against the Boer farmers, but instead found themselves bogged down in a long and bitter guerrilla war. The Boers' effective use of modern rifles and hit-and-run tactics inflicted heavy casualties on the British. To win, the British Army resorted to controversial methods, including a scorched earth policy and the use of concentration camps for civilians. The war was immensely costly in both loud-loser dens, and it damaged Britain's international reputation. It was a grim foreshadowing of the industrialized, total warfare that would dominate the century to come. The 20th century shattered the Victorian illusion of perpetual progress and imperial security. In 1914, Britain was drawn into the First World War, a cataclysmic conflict that reshaped the globe. Millions of men, many of them volunteers in so-called PALS battalions, were sent to fight in the trenches of the Western Front. Battles like the Somme and Passchendaele became synonymous with unprecedented slaughter, as machine guns and artillery wiped out a generation. The war was fought on an industrial scale, demanding the total mobilization of the nation's economy and society. It was a brutal attritional struggle that bled the country of its young men and its wealth, leaving deep and lasting scars. The end of the war in 1918 brought victory, but at an immense cost. The British Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, but the country was exhausted and heavily in debt to the United States. The trauma of the so-called Great War led to a widespread desire for peace, but it was not to last. Just 2 decades later, Britain was once again at war with Germany, this time against the aggressive expansion of Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime. The Second World War began in 1939, and by the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against a triumphant Germany that had conquered most of Europe. This was Britain's darkest hour. It was during this desperate period that Britain also had its finest hour. In the Battle of Britain, a small number of Royal Air Force pilots in their Spitfires and Hurricanes fought off the might of the German Luftwaffe, saving the country from invasion. The spirit of defiance was embodied by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose powerful speeches rallied the nation. The home front endured the Blitz, a relentless bombing campaign that devastated cities like London and Coventry, but failed to break the people's resolve. The war was a total national effort, uniting the country in a fight for its very survival against tyranny. Victory in 1945, achieved alongside its powerful allies, the Soviet Union and the United States, once again came at a terrible price. Britain was bankrupt, its cities were in ruins, and its empire was beginning to crumble. The war had accelerated the shift in global power, away from Britain and towards America and the USSR. Although Britain was on the winning side, the conflict marked the end of its time as a dominant world power. The immense sacrifices of 2 world wars had secured freedom, but it also irrevocably changed Britain's place in the world, setting the stage for the difficult process of decolonization and the search for a new role. The end of the Second World War in 1945 heralded a new and challenging era for Britain. The country, though victorious, was economically shattered. The political will and financial resources to maintain a vast global empire were gone. A wave of independence movement swept across Asia and Africa, and Britain began the difficult and often painful process of decolonization. This retreat from empire was not always peaceful, involving counterinsurgency campaigns in places like Malaya and Kenya. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt, ended in a humiliating political defeat, starkly demonstrating that Britain could no longer act independently without American approval. It was a clear signal that the imperial age was over. As the empire waned, a new global conflict emerged: the Cold War. Britain found a new role as a key member of the NATO alliance, standing with the United States against the Soviet Union. This new reality shaped its military posture for decades. The British Army of the Rhine stood guard in West Germany, a frontline force against a potential Soviet invasion. The nation developed its own independent nuclear deterrent, seeing it as the ultimate guarantee of its sovereignty and a ticket to a seat at the top table of international politics. The focus of British military strategy shifted from policing a global empire to contributing to the collective defense of Western Europe. Even in this new era, Britain still found itself fighting wars to defend its remaining territories and interests. The most significant of these was the Falklands War in 1982. When Argentina invaded the remote South Atlantic islands, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher dispatched a naval task force to reclaim them. The conflict was a major military undertaking, fought 8,000 miles from home. The successful campaign was a huge boost to British national pride and proved that, despite its reduced status, Britain was still a capable military power with a global reach. It was a surprising and decisive victory that defied many expectations about Britain's post-imperial capabilities. Today, the legacy of this long and complex history of warfare is woven into the fabric of modern Britain. The armed forces have adapted to new threats, participating in multinational coalitions in conflicts like the Gulf War, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The United Kingdom remains a leading member of NATO and a significant player on the world stage. This history of conflict is solemnly remembered every year on Remembrance Day. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the nation falls silent to honor the soldiers who fought and died in all wars. The poppy, a symbol born from the fields of Flanders, serves as a poignant reminder of the immense sacrifice that has shaped the United Kingdom.